You know, they say children should be protected, cherished, kept safe from the world's ugliness until they're old enough to understand it. Well, I was only 13 when the man who bought me from my daddy took me to his house. And I spent that first night curled up in a strange bed, waiting for the worst to happen. My name is Hattie Jean Calhoun, and I'm 87 years old now, living alone in this little farmhouse on the outskirts of Abilene, Kansas. Most folks around here know me as the lady who brings apple pies to church socials and tends the prettiest flower garden this side of the county line. They see these weathered hands arranging daisies and think they know my story. But they don't know how these same hands once trembled as a child bride, or how this heart learned to beat again after it was nearly broken before it even had a chance to grow. I've carried this story inside me for 74 years, locked it away so tight that sometimes I almost convinced myself it happened to someone else. But lying here in the quiet of these Kansas nights with nothing but the wind through the wheat fields and the memory of a life that began before its time, I realize that some stories aren't meant to stay buried. Some truthers need to see daylight, even if they come from the mouth of an old woman whose hands shake when she pours her morning coffee. So I'm going to tell you about 1948. When I was still a girl with braids and bare feet. When the Dust Bowl had left our land as dry as my mama's tears, and when desperation made my daddy do something that would change the course of my entire life. I'm going to tell you about fear and faith. About how sometimes the worst things that happen to us can lead to the most unexpected blessings. And how love can grow in the most impossible soil. Come sit with me a while and let me take you back to a time when I thought my childhood was ending forever, not knowing that maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of something I never could have imagined. Reckon most folks can't imagine what it feels like to be sold like a piece of livestock at auction. But that's what happened to me in the summer of 1948 when the drought had been going on for 3 years straight and our family was down to eating cornbread and molasses for every meal when there was any meal at. My daddy Cletus was a good man who'd been broken by circumstances beyond his control. I can still see him standing in our dusty yard, his hat in his hands, talking to Jedi Stone, a man whose shadow seemed to stretch longer than it should have in the late afternoon sun. Mr. Stone owned the Redemption Creek Ranch, thousands of acres that somehow stayed green, even when the rest of Kansas looked like the surface of the moon. He was older, maybe 40-some, with hands that looked like they could break a horse or a person with ease. I was sitting on the porch steps pretending to mend a hole in my only decent dress, but really I was listening to every word that passed between them. The conversation was hushed, urgent, punctuated by my daddy's coughing fits, that dry hack he developed from breathing too much dust. I heard numbers mentioned, amounts of money that seemed impossible in our world of empty cupboards and worn-out shoes. "She's a good girl," my daddy kept saying, his voice cracking like kindling real bright. "Even if she can't read yet, she'll work hard, do whatever needs doing." And that's when I understood. They weren't talking about hiring me to help with chores. They were talking about something permanent, something that would take me away from the only home I'd ever known. The realization hit me like a physical blow, stealing the breath from my lungs and making the world tilt sideways. My mama Willa came out then carrying my few belongings in a flour sack. Her face was the color of ash, and she wouldn't meet my eyes. She just stood there clutching that bag like it contained all the pieces of her broken heart. I wanted to run to her, to beg her to tell Daddy no, to explain that I could eat less, work more, be whatever. They needed me to be if they just let me stay. But children didn't have voices in decisions like these, especially girl. Children in family where the choice was between sacrifice and starvation. Mr. Stone looked at me then, really looked, and I felt something cold settle in my stomach. His eyes weren't cruel exactly, but they were calculating, measuring, deciding if I was worth whatever price they had agreed upon. He nodded once to my daddy, reached into his vest pocket, and pulled out more money than I'd ever seen in one place. The transaction was completed with a handshake, and the transfer of bills that crinkled in the dry air. Just like that, I belonged to someone else. As I climbed into Mr. Stone's wagon, my legs shaking so hard I could barely stand, I heard my mama whisper something that would haunt me for years to come. She said, "Lord, forgive us." So quiet that maybe only God and I were meant to hear it. The wagon pulled away from our little house, and I watched my family grow smaller and smaller until they disappeared entirely, swallowed up by the dust and the distance. I was 13 years old, sitting next to a stranger who now owned me, heading toward a life I couldn't imagine and didn't want. But I didn't know then what I know now, that sometimes the worst moments of our lives are just the beginning of a story we never could have written for ourselves. Sometimes what looks like an ending is really a doorway, even when we're too scared to see where it leads. And that first night at Redemption Creek Ranch, something happened that I never could have expected. Something that would change everything I thought I knew about my new life and the man who bought me. The Redemption Creek Ranch was like stepping into a different world, one where the drought seemed to have forgotten to touch the land. Green pastures stretched as far as my eyes could see, dotted with cattle that looked fat and healthy, not like the scrawny creatures back home that picked at whatever sparse grass they could find. The house itself was grander than the church back in town. 2 stories of white clapboard with a wraparound porch and windows that actually had glass in every pane. 2 colored women came out to greet us when the wagon pulled up. Beulah was the older one, maybe 50, with silver threading through her dark hair and hands that looked like they'd been working since before I was born. Suddy was younger, probably in her 20s, with a kind of smooth skin that made you think of fresh cream. They both looked at me with a mixture of curiosity and something that might have been pity, though they were too polite to let it show plain on their faces. "This here's Miss Hattie," Mr. Stone said, his voice matter of fact, as he helped me down from the wagon. "She'll be staying with us now." Beulah stepped forward and took my flour sack of belongings with gentle hands. "Come on, child," she said, her voice warm as honey. "Let's get you settled." Mr. Stone surprised me then by speaking directly to me for the first time since we'd left my family's place. "I expect you're tired and probably scared," he said, and his voice was softer than I'd expected. "Beulah will show you to your room. We'll talk tomorrow about how things work around here." My room turned out to be small but clean, with a real bed that had a quilt, prettier than anything I'd ever owned, and a window that looked out over those impossible green fields. It wasn't fancy, but it was nicer than the space I'd shared with my 3 younger siblings back home. What struck me most was that it was separate from the main part of the house, connected by a covered walkway, but clearly its own space. That first night, I lay in that unfamiliar bed, listening to sounds I'd never heard before. The distant lowing of well-fed cattle, the whisper of wind through leaves that weren't brown and brittle, the settling noises of a house that wasn't falling apart at the seams. I waited for Mr. Stone to come to my room, my whole body tense with fear, because I'd heard whispered stories about what happened to girls like me. Girls who got sold to men who could afford to buy them. But he never came. The next morning, Bueller brought me breakfast on a real china plate. And bacon and biscuits with butter. More food than I'd seen in months. She sat with me while I ate, studying my face. Like she was trying to read something written there. "Mr. Stone, he ain't what you might think," she said finally, her voice careful and measured. "He's got his ways, and he expects things done proper, but he ain't. He ain't the kind of man who hurts children." I wanted to ask her what she meant, what kind of man he was exactly. But the words stuck in my throat like dry bread. Over the next few days, I discovered that Mr. Stone had very particular routines. He rose before dawn, spent his mornings riding the ranch with his foreman, came back for dinner at exactly noon, and then disappeared into his study until supper time. He was polite to me but distant, like I was a piece of furniture he'd acquired, but wasn't quite sure how to use. It was on the fourth day that everything started to make sense, or at least a different kind of sense than I'd been expecting. Mr. Stone called me into his study after dinner, a room that smelled of leather and tobacco and old books. The walls were lined with more books than I'd ever seen in one place, and there was a big wooden desk covered with papers and ledgers. "Sit down, Hattie," he said, gesturing to a chair across from his desk. "I expect you're wondering what's expected of you here." I nodded, not trusting my voice. "Your father told me." "You can't read," he said. And it wasn't a question. "Oh, sir," I managed to whisper. "Well, that's going to change," he said. And there was something in his voice that might have been satisfaction. "Starting tomorrow, every afternoon after dinner, you'll come here and I'll teach you. Reading, writing, arithmetic, all of it." I stared at him, not understanding. "Sir, I don't have use for an ignorant wife," he said matter-of-factly. And the word wife hit me like a physical blow. "But I don't have use for a child bride either. You'll learn what you need to learn. And when you're old enough, really old enough, then we'll see what kind of woman you've grown into." That's when I realized that Jedediah Stone hadn't bought me for what most men would have bought a 13-year-old girl for. He'd bought me for something else entirely, something I couldn't quite understand yet. But that felt less terrifying than what I'd been imagining. He'd bought me for potential. And sitting there in that book-lined study with the afternoon light slanting through the windows and the smell of leather binding in my nose, I felt something I hadn't felt since the day Daddy shook Mr. Stone's hand. I felt like maybe, just maybe, I might survive this after all. But I had no idea then about the promise he'd made to himself, or about the choice he'd offer me when I turned 18. A choice that would change everything I thought I knew about freedom and captivity, about love and duty, and about what it really means to belong to someone. The lessons started the very next day, and that's when I began to understand that Jedi Stone was unlike any man I'd ever encountered. Every afternoon at 2 o'clock sharp, I'd find myself in that leather-scented study, sitting across from a man who had the patience to teach a frightened, ignorant girl how to make sense of the strange marks on paper that somehow held entire worlds inside them. The first book he put in front of me was a simple primer, the kind they used for small children in real schools. I felt my face burn with shame. A 13-year-old learning alongside pictures of cats and dogs and simple three-letter words. But Mr. Stone never made me feel foolish for my ignorance. He'd sit there in his big chair smoking his pipe, watching me struggle with letters that seemed to dance around on the page like they were trying to escape my understanding. Within a month, something magical started happening. Letters began to hold still and the words started making sense. And suddenly, I was reading actual sentences about things I'd never imagined. Stories about places beyond Kansas, beyond the dust and the endless struggle just to eat. Every day, I devoured every book he gave me like a starving person finally offered a feast. But it wasn't just the reading that changed me. It was the way he treated me during those lessons. Like my thoughts mattered. Like my questions deserved real answers. Nobody had ever acted like what went on inside my head was worth anything before. My daddy had loved me. I knew that. But he'd never thought to ask what I was thinking about or what I might want to learn. Mr. Stone did. He'd ask me what I thought about the stories we read, what I made of the arithmetic problems, whether I understood the geography lessons that showed me just how big the world really was. And when I gave him my stumbling, uncertain answers, he'd nod thoughtfully like I'd said something worth considering. That's when the real change started happening inside me. The shift that would make it impossible to go back to being the girl I'd been before. Started seeing myself differently, not as a piece of property that had been sold, but as a person with a mind that could grow and learn and understand complicated things. It was terrifying and wonderful all at the same time. The other change was more subtle but just as profound. I started noticing things about Mr. Stone that had nothing to do with fear. The way he'd rub his temples when he was tired from going over the ranch accounts. How he'd sometimes pause in the middle of a lesson and stare out the window with an expression I couldn't quite read. The careful way he'd turn the pages of his books, like they were precious things that deserved respect. Began to understand that he was lonely, though I couldn't have put words to it then. The house was big and well-appointed, but it felt empty in a way that had nothing to do with the number of people living in it. He ate his meals alone, spent his evenings alone, lived his entire life in a kind of careful isolation that seemed to suit him, but also seemed to weigh on him. One afternoon in late fall, maybe 3 months after I'd arrived, something happened that changed the air between us forever. I was reading aloud from a book of poetry, something about autumn leaves, and the passing of time when my voice caught on a particularly beautiful passage. I looked up to find him watching me with an expression I'd never seen before. Something soft and surprised and almost fond. For just a moment the careful distance he maintained between us seemed to shimmer and shift like heat waves rising from summer pavement. I felt something flutter in my chest, something that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the strange new person I was becoming under his patient teaching. He cleared his throat and looked away. And the moment passed, but something had been revealed that couldn't be taken back. He cared about what was happening to me in those afternoon lessons. Not just about whether I was learning to read and write, but about who I was becoming in the process. That night, lying in my little room with the autumn wind rattling the windows, I realized that I was no longer the same frightened child who'd climbed into his wagon 4 months ago. I was turning into someone else, someone I didn't quite recognize yet. And it was happening under the careful, patient attention of a man who'd bought me, but was treating me like I was worth something more than the price he'd paid. But what I didn't know then, what wouldn't become clear until much later, was that I wasn't the only one changing. Something was shifting in Jedediah Stone too. Something that would eventually force him to make a promise that would alter both our lives in ways neither of us could have predicted. And deep in the Kansas winter that was coming, I discovered that the careful boundaries he'd built around our strange relationship were about to be tested in ways that would reveal the true nature of the man who held my future in his hands. By the time spring arrived in 1949, I could read as well as most adults and write in a clear, steady hand that would have made any school teacher proud. But more than that, I could think about things in ways I'd never been able to before. The books Mr. Stone gave me had opened up corners of my mind I didn't even know existed, filled them with ideas about history and science and literature that made me feel like I was living in a much bigger world than the one I'd been born into. I was 14 now, though I felt older in some ways, and younger in others. My body was changing in ways that made me acutely aware of myself, of the space I took up in rooms, of the way Mr. Stone would sometimes glance at me during our lessons, and then quickly look away. The comfortable routine we'd established was beginning to feel different, charged with something neither of us seemed quite sure how to handle. It was during one of our afternoon sessions in late April that everything shifted irreversibly. We'd been reading a novel about a young woman making her way in the world, and I'd gotten so caught up in the story that I forgot to be careful about how I was sitting, how I was looking at him, how close I was leaning across the desk to point out a passage that had particularly moved me. When I looked up from the book, my face was maybe 2 feet from his, and I could see the exact moment when something fundamental changed in his expression. Not the fond paternal look I'd grown accustomed to, but something more complicated. Something that made my heart start beating so hard I was sure he could hear it. He pulled back like he'd been burned, stood up abruptly, and walked to the window with his back to me. The silence stretched out so long that I began to wonder if I'd done something wrong, if I'd somehow violated one of the unspoken rules that governed our strange relationship. When he finally turned around, his face had taken on a careful, controlled expression that I'd never seen before. He sat back down, but not as close as he'd been, and opened a different book entirely. Something about mathematics that was as dry and safe as the poetry had been dangerous. But the damage was done. Whatever had passed between us in that moment couldn't be undone. And from that day forward, our lessons carried an undercurrent of tension that made every accidental touch of fingers when he handed me a book feel like something significant. I started noticing things about him that I'd never paid attention to before. The way his jaw tightened when he was concentrating, the sound of his breathing in the quiet study, the careful way he kept his distance now when he was helping me with a particularly difficult passage, and I began to understand that he was struggling with something, fighting some kind of internal battle that had everything to do with me and the woman I was slowly becoming. The realization was both thrilling and terrifying. I was beginning to understand, in the wordless way that young women have always understood such things, that I had some kind of power over this man who owned me. Not the power that came from fear or obligation, but something else entirely. Something that seemed to grow stronger every day despite his obvious efforts to contain it. One evening in May, after a lesson that had been particularly tense with unspoken things, I was walking back to my room through the covered walkway when I heard him talking to Bueller in the kitchen. I shouldn't have stopped to listen, but the serious tone of their voices caught my attention. He was asking her about arrangements for sending me away. Maybe to a school back east where I could get a proper education, where I could be around girls my own age instead of living in this isolated bubble with a man old enough to be my father. The conversation was hushed, urgent, and I caught enough of it to understand that he was trying to solve a problem that was becoming too complicated for him to handle alone. Standing there in the gathering darkness, listening to him plan my removal from the only place I'd felt safe since leaving my family, I felt something break open inside my chest. Not heartbreak exactly, but something close to it mixed with a desperate understanding that I didn't want to leave. This place, this strange life. This man who taught me to see myself as someone worth educating. I didn't want to give any of it up. That night I lay awake planning what I would say to him, how I would convince him that sending me away wasn't the answer to whatever problem he thought my presence was creating. But what I didn't know was that fate was about to intervene in a way that would make all our careful plans irrelevant, because in just a few weeks, everything would change again. And the delicate balance we'd been trying to maintain would be shattered by news that would force both of us to confront the truth about what was really happening between us. And that truth would lead to a promise that would define the rest of both our lives. Promise I never could have imagined when I first climbed into his wagon as a frightened 13-year-old girl. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in June, carried by a rider who'd come all the way from town with news that would change everything. I was in the kitchen with Bula, learning how to make proper biscuits, another skill Mr. Stone insisted I needed to master when I heard his boots on the front porch, moving faster than usual, with an urgency that made my stomach clench with sudden worry. Dr. Morrison had been out to see him the week before, though at the time I'd thought it was just for one of his regular visits to check on the ranch. And Mr. Stone had seemed quieter than usual afterward, spending longer hours in his study with the door closed, but I'd attributed that to the usual business of running such a large operation. The truth was far worse than anything I could have imagined. Bueller and I exchanged glances when we heard him talking to someone in his study. His voice low and strained in a way I'd never heard before. The conversation went on for what seemed like hours, and when the visitor finally left, the house fell into a silence that felt heavy and ominous. That evening he didn't call me for our usual lesson. I waited in my room until well past our normal time, then ventured to the study to find the door closed and no light showing underneath. Suddy told me he'd taken his supper alone in his room and asked not to be disturbed. It was 3 days before he finally told me what the doctor had found. 3 days of watching him move through the house like a man carrying an invisible burden, of seeing him stare out the windows with that distant expression that had become more pronounced lately, of feeling the careful routine of our lives shifting into something uncertain and frightening. When he finally called me into the study, I could see immediately that something fundamental had changed. There were papers spread across his desk that hadn't been there before, legal documents with official seals that spoke of serious business being conducted. His face had taken on a grayish pallor that made him look older, more fragile than I'd ever seen him. He told me about the consumption, about how it had been growing in his lungs for months without his knowledge, about how Dr. Morrison had given him maybe a year, possibly less. He spoke in the same matter-of-fact tone he used when discussing ranch business, but I could see the effort it took him to maintain that composure. What shocked me most wasn't the news of his illness, devastating as that was, but the revelation that came next. He'd been writing letters, he told me, making arrangements not just for the ranch in his business affairs but for me. There was a son, he explained, a son he hadn't spoken to in years, who would be coming home to help manage things during the transition. Forrest Stone was 28 years old, a lawyer, practicing in Kansas City, and according to his father, a man who harbored considerable resentment about the choices that had led to their estrangement. He knew about me. Mr. Stone said knew about the arrangement that had brought me to the ranch, and he was not pleased about any of it. The way Mr. Stone explained it, Forrest saw me as evidence of his father's declining judgment, proof that illness and loneliness had driven him to make questionable decisions. He'd made his feelings clear in his letters. He wanted me gone, sent away to school, or married off to someone appropriate. Anything that would remove what he saw as an embarrassing complication from his father's estate. Sitting there in that familiar study, listening to Mr. Stone describe his son's plans for my future, I felt something cold and desperate begin to grow in my chest. This place, these people, this life I'd built from nothing. It was all about to be swept away by a man who'd never even met me, but had already decided I didn't belong. But then Mr. Stone said something that changed everything again. Something that revealed a depth of planning and consideration I never could have expected. He'd been working on his will. He told me making provisions not just for the ranch, but for my future legal arrangements that would ensure I wouldn't simply be cast aside when he was gone. There would be a choice involved, he said. A decision. That would be mine to make when the time came. He wouldn't tell me the details yet, but he wanted me to know that my future wasn't entirely in his son's hands. No matter what Forrest might believe that night, lying in my room with the weight of this new knowledge pressing down on me like a physical thing, I realized that everything I'd thought I understood about my situation was about to be tested. The man who'd saved me from one kind of fate was dying, and his death would bring another man into my life. One who saw me as a problem to be solved rather than a person to be protected. But somewhere in the legal documents spread across Mr. Stone's desk, in the careful provisions he was making for my future, lay the seeds of something I couldn't yet comprehend. A plan that would force his son to see me not as an inconvenience, but as something else entirely. And when Forrest Stone finally arrived at the ranch 6 weeks later, bringing with him all his anger and resentment and preconceived notions about what he'd find there, he would discover that his father's dying wish was more complicated than anything he could have imagined. Forrest Stone arrived on a Thursday afternoon in late July, driving a black automobile that looked as out of place on our dusty ranch road as a peacock in chicken coop. I watched from my bedroom window as he climbed out of that fancy car, brushing dust from his city clothes with obvious distaste, and I knew immediately that everything I'd feared about this man was probably true. He was tall like his father, but where Mr. Stone carried himself with the easy confidence of a man comfortable in his own skin, Forrest moved with a rigid precision that spoke of courtrooms and boardrooms and places where every word was measured for its legal weight. Even from a distance, I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he surveyed the ranch like he was already calculating its value and planning its disposal. The reunion between father and son was stilted and formal, conducted in the front parlor while I stayed hidden in the kitchen with Bueller and Suddy. Of us straining to catch fragments of conversation that drifted through the closed doors. What we heard wasn't encouraging. Clipped sentences about business matters, legal procedures, arrangements that needed to be made. Nothing that sounded like a son who'd rushed home to spend precious time with his dying father. That first evening at dinner, I was finally introduced to the man who would soon hold considerable power over my future. Mr. Stone had insisted I join them despite my protests that it might be better if I took my meals in the kitchen until the situation settled, but he was determined. To establish from the beginning that I was not a servant in his house, that I belonged at his table, regardless of what his son might think about it. Forrest's reaction to my presence was everything I'd expected and worse. He looked at me like I was something distasteful that had been left on his plate. His eyes taking in my simple dress, my carefully braided hair, my obvious youth, and finding all of it confirmation of whatever sordid story he'd constructed in his mind about his father's relationship with me. The conversation during that meal was excruciating. Mr. Stone tried to explain about my education, about how much I'd learned in the past year and a half, about my progress with reading and writing and mathematics. He spoke about me like I was his greatest accomplishment. His voice filled with a pride that made my heart swell, even as I cringed under his son's cold scrutiny. Forrest listened to all of this with the expression of a man being asked to admire a trained animal, politely skeptical about claims that seemed too good to be true. When Mr. Stone suggested that I recite some poetry I'd memorized or perhaps demonstrate my penmanship, I felt my face burn with humiliation. I wasn't a performing seal, and I had no intention of proving my worth to a man who'd already decided I had none. After dinner, while Mr. Stone retired early, the illness was making him tire more easily now. Forrest cornered me in the hallway outside the dining room. His first words to me, spoken in a low voice that wouldn't carry to his father's room, revealed exactly what kind of man I was dealing with. He told me he knew what I was, what kind of arrangement I represented, and that he had no intention of allowing his father's reputation to be tarnished by the presence of what he called an opportunistic child bride. He'd already made inquiries about schools that would accept someone of my background, places where I could be properly educated, and eventually married off to someone suitable to my station. Standing there in that hallway listening to this stranger plan my disposal like I was an unwanted piece of furniture, felt something harden inside me that had been soft before. The frightened girl who'd arrived at this ranch 18 months ago might have accepted his pronouncements meekly, but the young woman I'd become under his father's patient tutelage was not about to go quietly. I told him with all the dignity I could muster that his father was still alive and still master of this house, and that any decisions about my future would be made by him, not by a son who'd been absent for years, and knew nothing about the life that had been built here in his absence. The look that crossed Forrest's face then was one of pure surprise, as if he'd expected a cowering child, and found instead someone willing to stand up to him. But the surprise quickly gave way to something harder, more determined, and I realized I'd just made an enemy of the one person who would soon have the power to make or break my future. At night, I lay awake listening to the murmur of voices from Mr. Stone's study, knowing that father and son were having the kind of conversation that would determine what happened to me. When the consumption finally claimed the only protector I'd ever known, I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was heated, urgent, filled with the kind of passionate disagreement that comes when two strong-willed people discover they see the world in fundamentally different ways. What I didn't know was that Mr. Stone was revealing the full extent of his plans for my future, plans that went far beyond anything his son had imagined, plans that would force Forrest to choose between his own desires and his father's dying wish, between his preconceived notions about what I represented and the reality of what I'd become. And in that choice lay the seeds of something neither of us could have predicted. A partnership that would begin in hostility and grow into something neither of us was prepared for. Something that would ultimately prove that love can bloom in the most unlikely soil when it's watered with respect and nurtured with time. The weeks that followed Forrest's arrival were like living in a house where a storm was always threatening but never quite breaking. Mr. Stone grew visibly weaker with each passing day. The consumption stealing his strength in increments that were small enough to ignore individually, but devastating when you added them all together. His cough became more persistent, and I'd often find him in his study in the mornings, slumped over his desk like he'd fallen asleep working, and never quite managed to make it to his bed. But even as his body failed him, his mind remained sharp and he was conducting some kind of careful campaign that I couldn't fully understand. He'd spend hours closeted with Forrest going over ranch business and legal matters, but these sessions always seemed to end with raised voices and slammed doors. Forrest would emerge from these meetings looking frustrated and angry, while Mr. Stone would seem almost satisfied, like he was winning some invisible battle. The tension between Forrest and me had settled into a kind of cold warfare. He was scrupulously polite in front of his father, but when we were alone, he made his feelings clear through small cruelties that never quite crossed the line into open hostility. He'd make comments about my background, my education, my place in the household that were designed to remind me that I was there on sufferance and that sufferance would end the moment his father died. But something strange was happening too. Something I don't think neither of us expected. Despite his obvious resentment of my presence, Forrest was beginning to see evidence that his father's investment in my education hadn't been the foolish whim of a lonely old man. When business correspondence needed to be filed or accounts needed to be updated, Mr. Stone would ask me to help. And I could see Forrest watching with reluctant surprise as I handled tasks that required real skill and understanding. One afternoon in early August, when Mr. Stone was having one of his bad days and couldn't leave his bed, a crisis arose with one of the neighboring ranches over water rights that threatened to explode into a costly legal dispute. Forrest was trying to sort through his father's files to understand the history of the disagreement when I quietly offered to help. I knew exactly where the relevant documents were stored, could explain the background of the dispute going back 5 years, and even had suggestions about how it might be resolved based on similar situations I'd read about in Mr. Stone's law books. For the first time since his arrival, Forrest looked at me like I might be something more than an inconvenient reminder of his father's declining judgment. We worked together for several hours that day, and while he never said anything directly, I could feel his perception of me shifting slightly. Not enough to change his fundamental opinion about my presence in his father's life, but enough to make him question some of his assumptions about what kind of person I actually was. It was during this period that I began to understand the true complexity of what Mr. Stone was trying to accomplish. He wasn't just making provisions for my future. He was trying to engineer a situation where his son would be forced to see me as an asset, rather than a liability, where my practical value would override Forrest's emotional objections to what I represented. The ranch record showed careful documentation of my contributions over the past year. Not just my progress with reading and writing, but evidence that I'd been helping with actual business matters. That my assistance had saved money and prevented problems. Mr. Stone had been building a case, creating a paper trail that would make it difficult for his son to dismiss me as merely an old man's fully But the most shocking revelation came in late August, when Mr. Stone finally showed me the provisions he'd made in his will. Not just a modest inheritance or arrangements for my education, but something far more significant. He'd left me a substantial portion of the ranch itself. Enough to make me a partner rather than a dependent. Enough to ensure that Forrest couldn't simply cast me aside without significant financial consequences. The catch was that the inheritance came with conditions, requirements that would force both Forrest and me to work together for at least 2 years before either of us could claim full ownership of our respective portions. It was an elegant trap designed to ensure that his son couldn't act on his immediate impulses, but would have to spend enough time with me to discover what his father had already learned, that I was worth far more than the price that had originally been paid for me. Sitting in Mr. Stone's study that evening, looking at legal documents that would make me one of the wealthiest women in 3 counties, I felt something close to panic. This wasn't just generosity. It was a massive responsibility, a trust that I wasn't sure I was worthy of or capable of handling, and it would put me in direct conflict with a man who already resented my presence and would undoubtedly see this inheritance as theft of what should rightfully be his. That night, I could hear heated voices from the study again, louder and more angry than they'd ever been before. Mr. Stone had obviously told his son about the will, and Forrest's reaction was everything I'd expected and feared. The argument went on for hours, punctuated by long silences that were somehow more ominous than the shouting. When morning came, Forrest emerged from the house with the grim expression of a man who'd been backed into a corner with no good options. He looked at me across the breakfast table with something that might have been respect, but it was respect mixed with the kind of calculation you'd use when facing a worthy opponent. I realized then that Mr. Stone's grand plan was about to be put to the test, and that the next few months would determine whether his faith in both his son and me had been justified, or whether he'd simply created a situation that would destroy us both. Because time was running out faster than any of us had expected, and the choices we made in the coming weeks would echo through the rest of our lives. By September, Mr. Stone was spending most of his days in bed, though he still insisted on conducting business from his room when his strength allowed. The consumption had settled deep in his chest now, and every breath seemed to cost him effort he could barely afford. Dr. Morrison had stopped giving us time frames entirely, just shook his head sadly and told us to make him as comfortable as possible. It was during this time that I made a decision that would change everything, though I didn't fully understand the consequences when I made it. Mr. Stone had been asking me to help him with correspondence that was too tiring for him to handle alone, and I'd been spending hours each day in his room taking dictation for letters to business associates, old friends, and distant relatives he wanted to contact one final time. One afternoon, as I was helping him organize some papers, he suddenly grabbed my hand with surprising strength and looked at me with an intensity that cut through the haze of illness that had been clouding his eyes for weeks. He told me something then that I'd never suspected, something that made me understand his son's resentment in an entirely different light. Years ago, when Forrest was still a boy, there had been a woman, not Forrest's mother, who had died when he was very young, but someone Mr. Stone had planned to marry when his son was about 15. The engagement had ended badly amid scandal and accusations that Mr. Stone had never fully explained to his son, and the aftermath had driven a wedge between them that had never healed. Forrest blamed his father for choosing his own desires over his son's need for stability, for bringing shame on their family name in pursuit of what the boy had seen as selfish pleasure. The young man had left for college and then law school, and had maintained only the most formal contact with his father ever since, nursing a resentment that had calcified over years of silence and misunderstanding. Now, seeing his father's relationship with me, Forrest was convinced that history was repeating itself, that his father was once again allowing inappropriate desires to cloud his judgment. He couldn't see past his own painful memories to understand that what existed between Mr. Stone and me was something entirely different from what had happened all those years ago. Here's what shocked me most about that conversation. Mr. Stone asked me to forgive his son in advance for the hatred and suspicion he would undoubtedly direct toward me after the funeral. He asked me to remember that Forrest's anger came from old wounds that had never properly healed, and that underneath all that bitterness was a good man who'd simply never learned how to trust his father's choices. He made me promise something that seemed impossible at the time, that I would give Forrest a chance to know the real me. Not the version of me that existed in his suspicious imagination, that I would be patient with his hostility and tried to show him through my actions rather than my words, that I was worthy of the trust his father had placed in me. It was the hardest promise I'd ever been asked to make, because by that point I'd seen enough of Forrest's contempt to know that winning his respect would be like trying to convince a man who'd been bitten by a snake that not all serpents were dangerous. But I gave Mr. Stone my word, because how could I refuse anything to a man who was dying? A man who'd saved me from a fate I could barely imagine and given me a life I'd never dreamed possible. 3 days later, on a cool October morning when the leaves were just beginning to turn, Mr. Stone asked me to sit with him while he signed the final version of his will. His hands were so weak by then that his signature was barely recognizable. But his mind was clear, and he wanted me to understand exactly what he was asking of me. The inheritance was even more substantial than he'd originally indicated, but it came with responsibilities that would tie my life to this ranch and to his son for years to come. I wouldn't just be a wealthy woman. I'd be a working partner in a complex operation that required constant attention and careful management. I'd be bound to work alongside a man who saw me as a user and a threat. But there was something else in that will. Something Mr. Stone had never mentioned before. A clause that would allow me to walk away from all of it. The money, the land, the responsibilities. If I chose to marry someone else within 2 years of his death, it was an escape route, a way out if the burden of his gift proved too heavy to bear. Sitting there in that quiet room with the afternoon light slanting through the windows and the smell of approaching autumn in the air, I realized that Mr. Stone had given me something far more valuable than money or land. He'd given me choices, real choices, something I'd never had before in my entire life. I could stay and fight for my place in this world he'd created for me. I could take the safe path and find a husband who would provide security, without the complications that came with Forrest's resentment. Either way, I would never again be the powerless girl who'd been sold by her father to pay for grain and hope. That night Mr. Stone died peacefully in his sleep, and with his passing, the careful world he'd built around me crumbled into uncertainty. But his final gift, the gift of choice, would sustain me through everything that was to come, through the hostility and suspicion and gradual grudging respect that would eventually grow into something neither his son nor I could have predicted. Because sometimes the most valuable thing you can give someone isn't money or security, but the power to decide their own fate, even when all the available options are difficult ones. The funeral was held on a gray October day when the wind carried the smell of dying leaves and the promise of an early winter. Half the county came to pay their respects to Jedediah Stone, men who'd done business with him for decades, and women who remembered his first wife from before Forrest was born. I stood at the graveside in a black dress that Bueller had helped me choose, feeling the weight of all those curious eyes on me, hearing the whispered conversations about who I was and what I was doing there. Forrest delivered the eulogy with the controlled precision of a lawyer presenting a case. His words, carefully chosen to honor his father's accomplishments without revealing any of the complicated emotions that lay beneath his composed exterior. He spoke about duty and legacy and the importance of carrying on the work that his father had begun. But there was something hollow in his voice that suggested he was speaking as much to convince himself as to comfort the assembled mourners. After the service, when the last of the visitors had offered their condolences and departed, Forrest and I found ourselves alone in the big house for the first time since his father's death. The silence between us was heavy with unspoken tension, with all the things that needed to be said, but that neither of us seemed ready to address. It was Forrest who finally broke that silence, though not in the way I'd expected. Instead of the angry confrontation I'd been bracing myself for, he simply asked me to join him in his father's study so we could discuss what would happen next. His tone was formal, businesslike, as if we were strangers negotiating a contract rather than two people whose lives had been irrevocably intertwined by a dead man's will. The reading of that will conducted by Mr. Stone's lawyer from town was every bit as awkward and painful as I'd anticipated. Forrest's face grew stonier with each provision that was read aloud, each clause that made it clear how thoroughly his father had planned for my future, and how little room had been left for his son's objections. When the lawyer finished and departed, leaving us alone with the legal documents that would govern our relationship for the next 2 years, Forrest finally let his carefully controlled facade crack. The anger that poured out of him was years in the making. A toxic mixture of old grief and fresh resentment that had been building pressure like steam in a covered pot. He accused me of manipulating his father, of taking advantage of a sick old man's loneliness to secure my own future. He suggested that I'd planned this outcome from the moment I'd arrived at the ranch, that everything about my education and my apparent transformation had been calculated to achieve exactly this result. His words cut deep because there was just enough truth in them to make me question my own motives, to wonder if I had somehow encouraged Mr. Stone's feelings in ways I hadn't fully acknowledged, even to myself. But what hurt most was his complete inability to see past his own pain, to recognize what his father had actually accomplished. He couldn't understand that the girl who'd arrived here 3 years ago had been genuinely transformed by the patient attention of a man who had seen potential where everyone else had seen only a burden. He couldn't acknowledge that his father's investment in my education had been about more than romantic feelings or lonely desperation. It had been about creating something valuable from something that had been discarded. The confrontation escalated until we were both saying things we couldn't take back, cruel truths and painful accusations that revealed just how impossible our situation really was. I told him that his father had died, disappointed in the man his son had become, that years of stubborn pride had cost him the chance to understand or appreciate the good things his father had tried to build. He told me that I was deluding myself if I thought I could ever truly belong in this world, that I would always be the bot girl who'd gotten above her station through luck and manipulation. By the time our anger had burned itself out, we were both shaking with exhaustion and something that felt dangerously close to despair. The enormity of what we were facing. 2 years of forced partnership, the management of a complex operation that required cooperation. We clearly couldn't achieve. The weight of a dead man's expectations that neither of us felt capable of meeting seemed utterly overwhelming. That's when something unexpected happened. Something that would change the entire trajectory of our relationship. Forrest slumped in his father's chair with his head in his hands, began to talk about his mother's death and the loneliness that had shaped his childhood. He spoke about watching his father retreat into work and solitude, about the failed engagement that had driven them apart, about years of feeling like he'd lost both parents, even though one was still alive. For the first time since I'd met him, I heard vulnerability in his voice. Past the anger and resentment to the wounded boy, who'd never learned how to trust his father's love. And in that moment of unexpected honesty, I realized that we were both victims of circumstances beyond our control, both struggling to honor a complicated legacy that neither of us fully understood. I told him then about my own childhood, about the poverty and desperation that had led to my sale, about the terror of that first night when I'd expected the worst and found instead a patient teacher who'd seen something in me worth cultivating. I explained about the loneliness I'd witnessed in his father, the careful distance he'd maintained even as he'd invested in my future, the promise he'd extracted from me to give his son a chance to know who I really was. Something shifted between us in that conversation. Some small crack in the wall of mutual hostility that had defined our relationship since his arrival. Not forgiveness exactly, and certainly not trust, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. We were both grieving, both facing an uncertain future, both trying to figure out how to honor a man who'd left us with gifts we weren't sure we deserved. That night, for the first time since the funeral, I slept without dreaming of angry voices and impossible choices. And though I didn't know it yet, that conversation in his father's study had planted the seeds of something that would grow slowly over the months to come. Something that would eventually prove that his father's faith in both of us had been justified after. Because sometimes the most unlikely partnerships are forged in the crucible of shared grief. And sometimes the people who seem most incompatible are exactly what each other needs to become. Oh, what I'm about to tell you will sound impossible, but I swear on my mother's grave that every word is true. The real surprise of my story isn't what you might expect. It's not some dramatic revelation about forbidden love or scandalous secrets. The real surprise is how slowly, quietly, imperceptibly, two people who started as enemies can become something else entirely when they're forced to work toward the same goal. The first winter after Mr. Stone's death was the hardest time either Forrest or I had ever lived through. We were both grieving, both trying to manage a ranch that required decisions neither of us felt qualified to make alone. Both struggling with the weight of expectations that seemed impossible to meet. But somehow, in the daily necessity of keeping the operation running, we began to develop a grudging respect for each other's capabilities. Forrest discovered that my education hadn't been just decorative. I genuinely understood the business side of ranching, could handle correspondence with buyers and suppliers, could manage the books with an accuracy that impressed even his lawyer sensibilities. And I began to see that underneath his anger and resentment was a man with real integrity, someone who might disagree with his father's methods, but who was determined to honor his legacy despite his personal feelings. The breakthrough came in the spring of 1951 during a crisis with rustlers who'd been systematically stealing cattle from several ranches in the area. Forrest was preparing to ride out with the sheriff and a group of neighboring ranches to track down the thieves. And I made a suggestion based on something I'd read in one of Mr. Stone's old journals about a similar problem 20 years earlier. My idea to set up a coordinated watch system using the natural geography of the area proved to be exactly what was needed to catch the rustlers and recover most of the stolen stock for the first time since I'd known him. Forrest looked at me with something approaching admiration, and I realized that we'd crossed some invisible line from antagonism to partnership. But the real transformation happened so gradually that neither of us noticed it at first. Somewhere between the daily conversations about ranch business and the shared meals that became less stilted as the months passed, we began to actually enjoy each other's company. Forrest had inherited his father's dry sense of humor, and I discovered that I could make him laugh with observations about the peculiarities of ranch life that only someone who'd learned it all from scratch would notice. By the time our 2-year partnership was officially complete, the idea of dissolving our arrangement seemed absurd. We'd built something together that was worth more than either of us could have achieved alone, and we'd somehow become friends in the process, despite all the reasons we should have remained enemies. The marriage proposal, when it finally came, was the most unromantic thing you could imagine. We were sitting on the front porch one evening in late summer, going over the accounts and discussing plans for expanding the cattle operation when Forrest suddenly stopped talking and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. He said that he'd been thinking about our situation, about the choice his father had given me to walk away if I found someone else to marry, and about how much he'd come to depend on my partnership in running the ranch. He said he couldn't imagine working with anyone else, couldn't picture the place without me in it, and that if I was willing, maybe we could make the arrangement permanent in a way that would benefit both of us. It wasn't a declaration of passionate love, but it was something more valuable than that. It was an offer of genuine partnership from someone who'd come to know and respect who I really was. And when I said yes, it wasn't because I was swept away by romance, but because I'd found something I'd never dared to hope for, a place where I belonged, work that mattered, and a man who valued me for my mind as much as for anything else. We married in the fall of 1952 in a simple ceremony at the little church in town, with Ber and Suddy as my witnesses, and half the county in attendance. I was 20 years old and Forrest was 31. And we both understood that what we were building together was based on respect and shared goals rather than the kind of desperate passion that burns bright and fast. But here's the miracle that Mr. Stone somehow knew would happen even when neither his son nor I could see it. Respect and partnership given enough time and shared experience can grow into something deeper and more lasting than any other kind of love. Not the wild, consuming passion of storybooks, but the steady, reliable affection of two people who've chosen to build a life together and discovered that the building itself can be the most beautiful part. We had 4 children over the next 8 years and raised them to Understand that love comes in many forms. That sometimes the most precious things in life are the ones that grow slowly and quietly without fanfare or dramatic declarations. Forrest lived to be 78. And we had 43 years together. Before the cancer took him. 43 years of shared work and gradual affection and the deep satisfaction of knowing that we'd honored the faith that a dying man had placed in both of us. Now at 87, living alone in this house that holds so many memories, I understand what Mr. Stone was really trying to teach us both. He knew that the most lasting partnerships aren't built on initial attraction or dramatic passion, but on the slow accumulation of respect, trust, and shared purpose. He knew that two people who are forced to see each other clearly without the illusions that romance often brings can sometimes discover a compatibility that runs deeper than anything else. I'm telling you this story because I want you to understand that life rarely unfolds the way we expect it to. That sometimes the most difficult beginnings can lead to the most beautiful endings. That girl who was sold by her father for the price of winter grain grew up to become one of the most respected women in 3 counties. Not because of any dramatic transformation, but because someone saw potential in her and was patient enough to let it develop. And if my story has touched something in your heart, if you've heard echoes of your own struggles in the words I've spoken, then maybe you'll help my voice find its way to other souls who need to hear that it's never too late for a new beginning, that respect can grow into love, and that sometimes the most unlikely partnerships are the ones that endure. I'm still here in this little farmhouse in Kansas, still tending my garden and remembering a life that started with loss and grew into something beautiful. And I'd love to know where you're listening from. What city or town is hearing these words right now? Because every story deserves to travel and every voice deserves to find the ears that need to hear it most. So if you think someone else might need to hear about second chances and unlikely love stories, about the patient building of respect into something lasting, then maybe you'll share this old woman's words with them. 'Cause that's how hope spreads. One voice to another, one story touching another heart, one reminder that even the most broken beginnings can lead to beautiful endings. Thank you for sitting with me through this long remembering. Thank you for letting me share the story I've carried in my heart for all these years. And remember, it's never too late to begin again. Never too late to discover that you're worth more than you ever dared to believe. The story continues in the next chapter in the next linked video. But first, I need you to subscribe to join the family, as we are looking forward to hit our first 10,000 subscribers target, and feel free to share your story in the comments. You matter, your voice does too.